Distinguished guests and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to welcome you to the first event of our virtual internationalization update series. In recent months, we have had to make many changes to all aspects of our life, including how we study, work, and collaborate with our partners around the world. Today, we have the chance to not only learn more about how we can find the opportunities in this new normal, but also to experience it firsthand through this virtual event. It is a great privilege to have His Excellency Taha Moana Macpherson, New Zealand Ambassador to the Kingdom of Thailand, Kingdom of Cambodia, and Laos People Democratic Republic, to share with us his perspective on this new normal and what the future of education will look like in post-COVID-19. Mahidol University has a close relationship with our partners and the wider community in New Zealand, including through our work with University of Canterbury on the Mahidol University and University of Canterbury internship program. Since 2013, this exchange program has brought students from University of Canterbury to Thailand to undergo internship opportunity and to take part in cultural activities. The New Zealand Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia has supported this student on this internship, and His Excellency has come to Mahidol University on several occasions to greet and talk to these students. This event is the first in a series, helping the Mahidol University community to learn more about the new normal. And we will also have talks from both the French ambassador and Chinese ambassador in the future. So once again, I would like to express my sincere thanks to His Excellency Taha Moana Macpherson for sharing his thoughts and for his continuing support for collaboration between Thailand and New Zealand. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Virtual Internationalization Update. My name is Tatsama Khemanuchet, and today I will represent Mahidol students in this episode. Today, we received an honor from His Excellency Taha Moana Macpherson, New Zealand Ambassador to the Kingdom of Thailand, Kingdom of Cambodia, and Laos People's Democratic Republic. Your Excellency, good morning. Sawadee krap.
Sawadee krap.
Sawadee krap. Your Excellency, we have received questions from Mahidol students who are interested in the coronavirus pandemic situation in New Zealand,
Sure.
as well as the study opportunities after this. So we have received many questions from the students, and we have categorized them into 6 main questions that we would like you to answer.
Great.
Does that sound good to you?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. And thank you for having
I
me.
thought you were going to say no.
No, we're very
thank you.
friendly in New Zealand.
But thank you. Right. Okay. So in the past few months, we have seen the world unlike before. Millions of people have been infected, and hundred thousands of lives have been lost, and the global movement disconnected. Now, New Zealand is one of the countries successful in dealing with the pandemic. What are some of the measures that New Zealand has taken since the outbreak of the pandemic?
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for having me this morning. It's a pleasure to be talking to friends at Mahidol University on a very important matter as well. As you say, COVID-19 has really presented not only our countries but our global community with a series of unprecedented challenges, whether they're public health challenges, whether they're economic impacts, whether they're socio-economic impacts, and also global challenges in their nature. It's not just regional, it's not constrained to one country or one group of countries. We've really seen an unprecedented sort of set of impacts of this coronavirus. And sadly, I think they're going to be with us for some time. So, I mean, the first thing I would like to say on behalf of the New Zealand government is we are very committed to working with other countries to combat this virus. We recognise that thousands, millions of people have been impacted by it already, and our sympathies go out obviously to the families who have been dealing with loved ones who have been infected, and also of course our condolences go out to those people who have been killed by the virus, whether that's in Thailand, in New Zealand or other countries around the world. As you say, our response has been a very strong focus of the government for the last 6 months, as it has been in Thailand and in other countries. We took a decision to go hard and go early, based on a number of analysis which showed that if we didn't act very quickly, we would face a very significant health crisis. And so our government took a number of measures while we still had a relatively low number of cases in the country. We took border restrictions and we put those in place quite quickly. We launched a very significant public health education program and response sort of program as well. And we also introduced a 4-level alert system, which basically dictated how the country and how the population would have to act.
4-level system?
Correct, yeah. So it was a 4 levels. So we were in level 4 for about 5 weeks in about March. Level 4 was our highest level of alert. And so that means basically we're in full lockdown for all but essential services. Domestic travel was very constrained unless you were very essential travel. Most of our public workplaces were closed, shops, retail centres, so similar to lockdowns we've seen in other parts of the world. We then transitioned into level 3 and level 2. And we're currently in level 1, which basically means that without community transmission for a number of days, basically all of our domestic restrictions have been removed. However, our borders remain largely closed still.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
A very beautiful success for New Zealand.
Well, we're confident that we've gotten to a good place, but we're also very, very focused on not being complacent. We understand and we see what's happening in the world. We also are very conscious of the risks of a second wave or subsequent waves of coronavirus. And so it's very important for us that we don't actually rest on our laurels. We don't actually take it easy. We're continuing to ensure that our measures and our preparedness are very high. I would say one other aspect of our response, which has been very important, has been it's a community-wide response. So our Prime Minister and our government have said we're a team of 5 million. New Zealand's a country of 5 million people, and we see that all of those people have a responsibility or have a contribution to make to ensuring that we remain safe and we protect each other. And so under the banner of Unite Against COVID-19, we've really sort of tried to encompass that this is actually a very, very nationwide response to the virus, and we've been very, very appreciative of the fact that the New Zealand population has been largely very, very strongly committed to this effort. And I think you can say the same thing about Thailand, where we've also seen a very strong public health response to COVID-19 to this point as well.
So you would say it was the community effort that's led us to this success, right?
Yes, very important. Very important was that the community and the population. I mean, we're a small country. We're lucky. We're a small island country, and so we've been able to sort of take measures that have allowed us to really sort of build a strong process to prevent the spread of the coronavirus and community transmission and break any chains of community transmission. But as you say, that's very much been reliant on the entire population really being committed to playing a role in ensuring that we remain safe as a country.
Now you mentioned that New Zealand has taken the measure very early to prevent the spread of the virus. So in Thailand, when we put the lockdown in place, that the number of daily cases was around 100 per day, and the total cases was around 2,000. How about in New Zealand, where by the time that the lockdown was put in place?
So we took the actions reasonably early on when we had still a relatively low number of cases, and again that was based on the fact that our modelling showed that if we didn't act quickly, while we had, like, I think it was tens if not hundreds of cases, we still are at very low numbers of deaths, so we've had only around 50 deaths, but it was very quick. And I think one of the benefits we had, again, I mentioned we're an island nation, so we actually only had our first confirmed reported case quite late compared to some other countries. So obviously Thailand was one of the first countries that reported a case in January. So we were a little bit later than that. And that allowed us, I think, to prepare, so to put in different sort of parts of our response process. And that meant that when we moved to actually implement our alert system, we were able to move between those different levels quite quickly. You know, we're also very conscious that we may have to move back up to higher alert levels in future, because we are constantly monitoring the situation around the world, and we are also very aware that there is a risk that it could come back.
And I am curious, in Thailand we have one tracing applications that we call Thai Chana or Thai Wins applications. Is that the same kind of applications in New Zealand?
We're developing a tracing app. Contact tracing has been a very important part of our response as well, as it has been in Thailand, and so we are very conscious that if you're going to ensure that you don't have community transmission, that actually contact tracing is very important. So our health ministry is in charge of a very active contact tracing program. That includes the development of applications. So we're in the midst of developing a contact tracing app now. I'm not sure if it's been implemented yet, but we're certainly looking at other innovative ways we can ensure that people who may have been in contact or may have been infected, we're able to very quickly track down people around them, with the objective again of breaking down community transmission. And I have to say, like, one of the things we've been watching obviously Thailand's response very, very closely as well, and the contact tracing has been a very, very important part of Thailand's response, and very impressive as well. And I have to say, in the provinces where the village health volunteers have, it seems to me at least, played a very important role in making sure that people are closely in contact with the people who have come back from the provinces or entering the provinces. And so I think contact tracing and testing in Thailand has also been a very important and impressive part of your response.
I agree. So according to you, when comparing Thailand to New Zealand, what do you think are the differences or the similarities in our measures?
Well, I think, you know, there is no one-size-fits-all response to COVID.
I agree.
Thailand's a much bigger country. It's got very big land borders, and so we obviously, and I'm not an expert, so I can't really comment on the scientific aspects of it. But I think there are certain things that I look at and I think have been quite similar. And one is, again, a very strong response and a very strong public health framework, which has been led by, I think Thailand's response has largely been led by advice from public health officials, which has been very similar to New Zealand. I mean, one of the things I think which has been one of the strengths of our response has been based on science, and advice from public health officials based on that science. Another thing which I think Thailand has done, which New Zealand also did reasonably well so far, is a very strong public health education system, right? So information about how our communities and how our people
to prevent the spreading.
Exactly, how they can prevent the spread, how they can protect their communities, measures that individuals can take, such as hand washing and social distance.
Wearing masks.
Exactly, wearing masks. So, like New Zealand and Thailand, I think were very good at putting information out, and then I think that led to a very strong also community commitment. I mentioned in New Zealand we have a team of 5 million. You know, Thailand, you've got a team of 70 plus million who also have been very committed to doing what they can to protect each other, to protect the community, to protect the country. And then the last thing I think is that contact tracing, I think, has been a very important part of both of our responses, as we've already discussed. So I think when we look at Thailand's response and we look at New Zealand's response, I think we've both had some very strong aspect of these responses, which have been largely in common.
Now, when we mentioned the contributions of the community to this effort, but unfortunately, as one of the consequences of the pandemic, millions of people are predicted to lose their job. So are there any measures in New Zealand that were put in place to address this issue?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, the economic impact of COVID, I think, has been unprecedented in all of our countries. And New Zealand, for example, like Thailand, again, if I'm looking at parallels, tourism is a very big part of our
Agree. About 15% of Thai GDP.
Correct. And in New Zealand, it's about 10% altogether. So it's a little bit less, but around the same. And education is our fifth biggest export earner, which relies largely on international students. So those are two examples where already we're seeing a very significant economic impact because we've had to, introduce these border restrictions. And we're also facing some significant other impacts, of course, due to the slowdown of exports and things like that. So our government has been very focused in two ways. We've been very focused in providing businesses, and particularly SMEs, support. So we've introduced things like a wage subsidy, which has allowed our companies to ensure that they can pay their workforce. We've allowed debt repayment holidays, for example, so people have been able to stop repaying their loans or their mortgages for a while we go through this COVID thing. And we've also included a number of other sort of support packages to industry, and particularly with a focus on SMEs, because, again, similar to Thailand, SMEs are a very important part of the backbone of our economy. And we're looking presently at other stimulus measures as well to support retraining, to support jobs. So people who, for example, may lose their jobs, we're looking at how we can retrain them and reintegrate them into the economy, which is going to be challenging, but it's something we think we have to plan on now. So economically, that is the domestic side of it. So we're very focused on trying to protect and ensure that our workforce and our workers, are actually able to come through COVID to the best that our government is able to support them to do so. And then the second thing is an international thing. I mean, for New Zealand, we're a small trading country. Very reliant on open global markets. Similar to Thailand, exports is a very important part of our economy as well. And if you're not able to trade, then obviously we're not able to allow our workers are impacted by that as well. So we're very focused on trying to keep global markets open and working with partners like Thailand, whether regionally or bilaterally or on a multilateral basis, to ensure that the continued flow of goods can continue unfettered. And we see, obviously, in times like this, a lot of countries tend to want to close down rather than open up. We think that would be a mistake. We think it's important that countries remain open, that we continue to stimulate trade and regional integration, and that we try and continue to ensure that the world economy can recover from this as quickly as possible. So both from an international perspective and a domestic perspective, the economic impact is a very real one for us as well, and a very strong focus of our government.
To ensure that as few people are affected as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's tough because, as you say, it's an unprecedented global economic impact, and it's one which there's no clear horizon, right? Because it's, unfortunately, COVID seems to be going a little bit up and down around the world, and there's no real ability to plan on how quickly we'll come out of this. But you can take certain measures to help support your workers, to help support your companies, and to help support the global trading system, which we think in the longer term will be very important as we emerge from COVID.
Is there also any measures that were put in place to address the mental health of the population?
Yeah.
Because surely this pandemic has been very stressful.
Yeah, and again we see this around the world, right? I mean, going into lockdown, being isolated from your normal social and societal sort of support networks, not being able to see your families sometimes, being separated from family members, not being able to travel, it's put some very severe constraints on how people were living their lives very quickly. And so we have been very focused as well. It's not just a public health issue, there are mental health issues which are also, as you say, very important to address, because mental health can be as harmful to people, mental health issues can be as harmful to people as the physical health issues. So our Ministry of Health has led a very significant program by developing resources for people, because there are two sort of broad groups, right? There are vulnerable groups, so groups that may already have mental health issues or maybe struggling with mental health issues, and it's very important that they continue to be supported. But then there's other people who may not have, had mental health issues in the past that now find themselves starting to develop mental health issues due to the impacts of COVID. And so it's very important to also provide that group of people with support and the resources, and then if necessary the medical help that they need to actually confront those problems and hopefully we hope overcome them. But the mental health issues are very important, and I think again when you're dealing with such a range of impacts of COVID-19, mental health issues are probably one that we are only now starting to realise as we see the impacts of these ongoing close downs, is how important it is to address those and how significant they may be around not only our individual countries but around our region and around the world.
Right, we cannot exclude anyone from this protection.
Absolutely not. And I think the mental health side of it is really important one, and it's one of the ones that, as I say, I think we'll continue to look at ways we can actually help address this issue through resources. So if you go onto our Ministry of Health website in New Zealand, there's a very significant set of resources available to support people's mental health.
That's very good. That sounds very nice.
Thank you.
Okay, and so what is the situation in New Zealand right now? Is New Zealand still a COVID-free country as was announced in June?
So New Zealand is free of community transmission of COVID.
Community transmission?
Correct. So for now. And so we still have some cases. We have, I think, 27 active cases right now, most of which, similar to Thailand again, have been cases that have been detected at the border from people returning
imported
to New
cases.
Zealand. Correct. And all of those, as far as we're aware, are currently in state facilities and state quarantine.
State quarantine.
So within the community, again, we don't have any known cases of community transmission, and we haven't for a number of days now, which we hope will continue to be the case. And that, again, has allowed us to go back to level 1 of our alert system, which means that within the country, people are largely allowed to move freely and act as if they were acting in the way before COVID. But again, that also means that our borders have largely remained closed to most people, except for a managed number of people returning to New Zealand.
For New Zealanders who return home? Largely.
And there are a few other sort of categories of people that can come in as well, but right now it's very limited. Again, we're a small country, so we're very, very focused on ensuring that as we welcome people back into the country, they can be managed effectively from a health perspective, and so that ensures that we try to make sure our quarantine procedures are as robust as possible. And so we're limiting the number of people that can come back presently to ensure that our quarantine facilities are able to manage that process, similar to what's happening in Thailand.
Right. Actually, you mentioned a really good point. So as there is no community transmission in New Zealand, how does the government plan to resume its economic and social activities?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question which I think a lot of our policymakers in Wellington are putting a lot of attention to right now. So within the country, as I say, actually economic activity has resumed largely. So the factories are all working, restaurants are all open, hotels can operate, but there are some very important sectors which require us at some point to allow the borders to reopen.
For instance?
Tourism, for example, which is very, very significant, international education, and others. So we are looking at ways where we can actually start safely allowing certain cohorts to return into New Zealand. But I think that's a process that the government is very cautious about and wants to make sure that we have very robust policies and policy frameworks and then implementation frameworks to allow that if we and when we open the country back to certain cohorts of people, and I think international students is very high up in our sort of thinking about how we might do that safely. But I think the key word is safely, because I think we want both the people coming in and our community.
We want everyone to be safe.
Exactly, and we want New Zealand to remain a welcoming country. I mean, we've always been very welcoming. Hospitality is a very intrinsic part of how we treat our guests. But I think in this particular environment, we want to make sure our guests are safe, and we also want to make
the host is safe
our
as well.
Communities are safe as well. Yeah.
So let's suppose that Thailand is able to maintain its record of zero community transmission, as so does New Zealand. What's the possibility that we could establish a travel bubble between the two countries?
It's a really good question, and it's one we've, I've been sort of in contact with Thai authorities about. So we are looking at ways we can, as I've mentioned, we can safely open the borders to allow groups of people to come back into the country and groups of our own people to travel overseas as well. Our priority has been Australia and the Pacific. So we've for some months now been looking at how we might open a travel bubble, initiate a travel bubble with Australia, and I think that's because it's our closest neighbour, and it's also a country with which we already have a very open relationship. So there are certain reasons why that makes a lot of sense to us. That process is going to, again, a very cautious and careful process, and I think we're still working through some of the details of that. And then we're also looking at the Pacific, because the Pacific is very important to us. New Zealand has the biggest Pacific population. Auckland's the biggest, we like to say, the biggest Pacifica city in the world. And also, so we feel that we have a strong relationship, an important relationship, and also some responsibilities to try and ensure the Pacific voice and the Pacific economies are well understood, what the issues they're facing. So we're working very closely closely with the Pacific Island governments as well, and Australia. So once and when we get to the point we're convinced we can actually implement or have implemented travel bubbles with Australia, and have seen what we can also do in terms of freedom of movement with the Pacific Islands, then we'll start, I think, sort of looking at other options. And I think Thailand would be a very important option to look at, because, as you say, we've both so far done pretty well in terms of our public health response, and so we're staying in contact with Thailand. So we're talking to Thailand about various areas where we see we might be able to cooperate in terms of COVID. So travel is one of them, as you say. Supply chain security, ensuring that we can move our trade together, opening up for tourism. Making sure that we work together on the international forum to protect our international interests, and then regional integration and cooperation as well. So for me, we see a lot of areas there where New Zealand and Thailand can cooperate together, where we have shared interests moving forward, and of course education is one of those ones as well.
So cooperation between Thailand and New Zealand is possible in the future, but a more reasonable step would be to first establish these connections with, like for example, Australia or countries in the Pacific first.
I think that has been our priority. I mean, because again, we have a number of inbuilt kind of benefits with Australia in terms of we already have a very close, open relationship. Regulatorily, we're very closely aligned. There's free movement of people already between Australia and New Zealand largely. So we made a conscious choice to sort of look at Australia first, because we feel if we can put a model in that works for Australia, we can then hopefully look at how that model might be applied to other countries.
How about the education sector? Are the schools and universities open right now?
They are. Yep, they're all working. Our very highly sort of rated international universities and tertiary educations and schools are all open and they're all functioning. And again, that's by virtue of the fact that we're at alert level 1. And so they're all operating in accordance with their normal criteria, but they're also starting to operate slightly differently and looking at other mechanisms, which again, so we're looking at what we call blended delivery models, which will also help international students, because they allow a mixture between online and then in-person sort of courses, right? So kind of a combination of the two. And for international students, because it is a challenge for us, because of the borders are closed, international students can't presently come into the country. So what we're like doing, for example, the University of Canterbury is doing a course whereby you can do the first semester online, with the hope that by the time that you move on to the second and third semesters, that you'll be able to travel back into the country and complete your courses there. So we're looking at new innovative ways we can sort of help address and ensure that international students can still experience New Zealand education, but one which reflects the realities also of the environment which we're in due to COVID-19.
I think we will return to that issue very soon. But then, looking at the resumptions of the economics and social activities, so what could we expect to see of New Zealand in terms of the changes in the way of living, or the so-called new normal?
Well, I think again, our new normal is really based on constant assessment of the situation within New Zealand, and then also a very close focus on what's happening around us in the international community, right? So I think the 4-level alert system remains in place. So that largely dictates our new normal. Right now we're at level 1 because we feel there's no community transmission, and hasn't been for some time. But we're also ready to transition back up to levels 2, 3 and 4 should the need arise. Because like everyone, we're very conscious of the possibility or the risks of a second wave. And we're also very conscious that there are a lot of aspects about COVID-19 we're still learning about and not aware of. But ideally, again, we're a very open country. You know, New Zealand is one of the biggest per capita travelling countries in the world. So ultimately, we're also very closely focused on how we might both open up our borders to allow economic activities such as tourism and trade and education to resume, but also how we can allow our people to travel to and from New Zealand.
But how about domestic activities? Like, for example, the consumption behavior of the population, that surely changed, right?
Yeah, I think it will. I think, there are similar trends in New Zealand. I think people are more cautious. I mean, people are obviously worried about the future. People are concerned about the job markets and the economic impact. So I think we are seeing things, saving rates are obviously going up, and people maybe aren't spending as much. One thing which has really helped the New Zealand economy, including through COVID, is we still remain very much a largely an agricultural exporting country,
Like
and
us.
we're also an exporter of healthy, nutritious, and we think delicious food products. And
Kiwi?
So, yeah, kiwi, of course. In fact, I've just been doing a food promotion. There's something called Taste New Zealand, which is on in Thailand.
I saw
You
that.
it?
I saw
Okay,
that. I saw
go-
that.
Kiwi fruit is a wonder fruit, right?
I saw that. Right.
But in the COVID context, the fact is there is still a demand for New Zealand produce, for New Zealand food, New Zealand beverages, and we're still exporting those. So that's a very important part of our economic well-being, and I think that has ensured that large parts of our economy have been able to continue functioning as is. But you're right. You're absolutely right. Consumer behaviour is changing. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. People are being more cautious, and I think as long as COVID-19 continues to be with us, we're likely to see more. That's going to be likely to be more of a factor as people move forward.
Are we seeing more rises in the e-commerce or e-governance in New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean we've always been we've always been a pretty good testing place for e-commerce and technology. So we're very proud of the fact that we've been quite an innovative. We're a very innovative country. I mean, when we talk about our education system, very future focused, very focused on preparing people for the future. That means that we are very highly focused on ensuring that technology platforms, and innovation remains a very high part of how our government and our education system operates. So we were already quite a high user of e-commerce platforms before COVID-19. And I imagine we're all using Zoom a lot now, right? We're using Microsoft Teams or things like that. So I think you will continue to see also changes in how businesses operate, and they will probably take much more advantage of those types of e-platforms moving forward to carry out meetings and to integrate, particularly because we can't travel as much. So I think you are seeing sort of both in terms of how businesses are operating, and how technology is becoming more of a focus in terms of how we interact with our colleagues and other businesses or other colleagues, and then as you say in e-commerce and how we actually undertake our business. We've always been quite a high adopter and adapter of those types of platforms, but it's likely I think it'll probably accelerate that trend as well.
So in a way, we are seeing opportunities and progress in this sector in the future. But so then, when we look at, there's something I saw when I did the research on New Zealand that's called telehealth. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, so telehealth is, again, this falls very much into kind of what you were just asking about. So telehealth, right? Basically, it's a lot of New Zealanders. We're a big country with a small population, and a lot of people live in the countryside, and a lot of people live in smaller communities, and so sometimes it's not easy for them to get immediately to the doctor, or they have to travel a long time, or hospitals are a fair way away. So telehealth largely allows people to basically either use their computer or use their phones to call in and to get medical advice from health professionals. So, for example, if you're feeling Department of Health, and they'll provide you advice and an initial analysis of what they feel might be what you're suffering from, and then give you some advice on what your next steps need to be.
Is that like seeing doctors like online, like through Zoom meeting?
I think that's where we're heading towards, right? I think it is kind of becoming more a Zoom doctor's consultation or an online doctor's consultation. So we're not alone. Other countries do this as well. But I think for New Zealand, it suits us because, again, there's many smaller communities that are often quite a distance away from large hospitals or large urban centres. And so for them, again, utilising technology or being able to utilise that technology to get an immediate analysis or immediately, contact doctors or hospitals and say, look, this is what I'm feeling, do you have advice, and what shall I do next? It's quite important.
And to allow that to be possible, to be feasible, well, we will need like a very broad internet connections around the country.
Yeah, it's really important. It's been a real strong focus of successive New Zealand governments is getting very high-speed internet connectivity, because it helps on things like this. It also helps business effectiveness for farms, and it also helps education for again, rural and isolated and smaller communities. So we've been very focused as a country, and several governments have been very focused on ensuring we have very broad and very widespread broadband internet connectivity.
Well, so right now New Zealand is harvesting all the investment that they did in the past.
Yeah, I think we've done a lot of planning around this, but I think there's always areas we can improve. I think there are always lessons that we're learning, and I think the key is that we apply those lessons into practical solutions moving forward. I mean, we're in a situation, before COVID where we can't stand still. The world is constantly evolving. It's a big global community and marketplace out there, and we're a very small part of that. But we realize that to ensure that our communities remain safe and prosperous and connected, very good word, connected, that we have to be keeping up with those global trends, and we have to be trying to ensure that we're not falling behind. And again, that's there are some challenges there, because we're a small country at the bottom of the Pacific. And we're a long way away from a lot of big markets, and so technology becomes a very important part of how we stay connected, as you said, and also how we ensure that our prosperity and our health and safety continues to be met to the standards that I think our population would hope.
Now, speaking of education, Thai universities have had good relations with universities in New Zealand.
Yes.
For instance, Mahidol University has an agreement with the University of Canterbury, which mainly is an internship opportunity. Will there be a continuation of such opportunities or financial supports in the future, given that the cost of the COVID after this pandemic has ended is high?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the answer is yes. So I think, as you say, every major New Zealand university has some sort of relationship with a Thai counterpart university. As you say, Mahidol does with the University of Canterbury, and other major universities in Thailand have also relationships similar to what Mahidol does with other universities in New Zealand. International education is a very strong focus of our government right now. It has been. It's our fifth biggest export earner. It's worth about $5 billion a year for New Zealand, so it's not insignificant. In fact, it's very significant. COVID, as you say, has really impacted our international education relationships, because of the fact that we can't allow people to come into the country right now because of the border restrictions. However, we are very actively thinking how we can actually allow our international education market to still prosper in a COVID-19 world, right? So, for example, as I mentioned, we've got these blended delivery models now for certain courses, which...
So, studies online first and then continue in the second or third trimester
in the second and third trimester, people can come into the country and continue their study face-to-face in New Zealand. And we've also we've recognised that might not work for everyone. So, for example, University of Canterbury has changed the payment model for some of these courses, whereby we give people an opportunity to try out the online stuff to see if they like it, and if they like it, then they commit to the course, and then they pay from there. So it's a sort of try before you buy kind of model.
Try before you buy.
But we're also conscious that, in order to provide what we consider to be a very strong international education experience in New Zealand, we are going to have to think of ways whereby we can safely allow students to return to New Zealand. And I think, while we've made it clear that won't be in time for this semester, our Education New Zealand and Education Ministry and our ministers with other agencies in New Zealand government are closely looking at ways we might start trialling, allowing certain small cohorts of international students to come in, hopefully before the end of the year, but that will be very much subject to what happens with COVID-19, with a view to opening up a safe pathway to allow students to return.
Now, I might have to ask this because one of our students sent in these questions, but as the New Zealand's borders remain closed, what's the possibility that students can continue their study exchange during this period of time, given that the foreign students are quarantined on arrival?
Well, I mean, there's two aspects to that. For foreign students already in New Zealand who are already concerned about what happens to them, the government's very focused on ensuring that they're able to continue their studies. So, for example, there have been some visa extensions for students who are already in New Zealand, and also we have an International Student Hardship Fund, which has been set up to allow students or community organisations or education institutes to apply for funding to allow them to support students who might be suffering hardship as a result of COVID. The other thing we've done is we've temporarily relaxed our working conditions for international students. So, for example, international students now are able to work in what we're calling essential services to help support themselves. So again, that allows people to work to earn money if they're concerned again by their financial situation. And international students in New Zealand are allowed and able to access free healthcare if they're concerned that they have COVID-19. So for students already in New Zealand, we're very conscious that they might be suffering hardship, or they might be also suffering concerns about, okay, what happens now? I'm in the middle of my degree, and can I return home?
This happens. What should I do?
Can I return to New Zealand to complete my studies? So for those students, there's been a strong focus on ensuring that they're supported. For international students looking to come in, as you say, there are limitations on how people can enter New Zealand right now, and if you do come in, everybody does have to presently do a 14-day quarantine period. But once you're through that quarantine period, then you can enter New Zealand, and we're in level 1 of our lockdown or our response. And so once you're through that quarantine period, and that quarantine period applies to everyone. So if I went home to New Zealand, I'd have to do a 14-day quarantine period as well. So it's not just applied to certain groups, it's applied to everyone, including New Zealand citizens re-entering the country. And unfortunately, that is the reality. I mean, again, we've discussed at length the importance of these measures that the government feels are necessary to keep our country safe, both for visitors and for students coming in, and for our communities. So I think the reality is we will face certain restrictions for some time, but that's to ensure that once you get through those restrictions and you enter New Zealand, you actually are entering a safe community and a safe country. Yeah.
So as we know that the possibilities remains open as long as all the procedures are followed.
Correct.
Okay, so now that we know that there will be a continuation of studies, absolutely, there will be a continuation. Then what can we expect to see? Will there be new regulations or policies that were put in place after the end of COVID-19 that Thai students who are interested to continue their studies in New Zealand should know? For example, limitations to number of students per classroom or per enrollment, or as you mentioned, that try before buying.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I don't have a clear answer on that. I will say that in terms of international students, there are presently no regulations or limitations on international students in terms of how they apply for the courses. They do have to meet the quarantine requirements. They do have to meet our COVID requirements, and for any student studying for longer than 3 months, you do need a student visa. However, beyond that, you can choose to study at any institution, whether that's a university or a technical university, any part of the country you're free to travel to, and also we've got a very large number of high school students as well as university students. So wherever you want to go in New Zealand, whatever institution you want to study at, you can apply to, and hopefully you'll get accepted to that university. And I would suggest very strongly that anyone who's interested in going to New Zealand to study, go to our Study in New Zealand website, because it has a lot of information about the different courses, the different parts of the country and the different institutions where you can study at. And it also has a lot of information on some of the financial assistance, scholarships and other sort of assistance that's available to students. And that's probably the best way of keeping up to date with what's happening in New Zealand, because as you rightly said, COVID is going to probably introduce a whole lot of changes, or not a whole lot of changes, but some changes to how we set up our classrooms for things like social distancing, class sizes, terms, e-learning, blended delivery models like you were alluding to and we've discussed. And so I think a lot of that will be an ongoing process, will be a process which, as we learn more about COVID and as we learn more about how we need to respond to COVID, you will see new policies introduced on an ongoing basis to allow us to ensure that we keep up with all of that. So I'm sure there will be some new sort of policies and approaches and frameworks introduced over the coming months. I mean, those haven't been already introduced, but I'm sure our policymakers are looking very closely at them. And so Study in New Zealand. The Study in New Zealand website is the place to go.
Study in New Zealand website.
Correct. And that has a lot of information on for international students and on our study courses, on our education institutions, on the support that might be available to international students, on the border restrictions. So Study in New Zealand, that's the resource.
Now we have seen some students send in questions that they are interested in studying in the field of dentistry or engineering. But will there be new field of studies that are open in the future in response to the COVID pandemic?
It's a good question, and I honestly don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm sure there'll be new aspects of our medical, we've got very good medical schools at some of our universities, and I'm sure medical research and epidemiology will, obviously, there'll be a strong focus on COVID-19 moving forward, but I don't know, I wish I did, but I can envisage that there probably will be, but I have no idea what they might be because I'm not an expert in that area.
But for students who are interested in the existing field of studies, they can go to the website to look at everything up.
Study in New Zealand.
Study in New Zealand.
Or contact our Education New Zealand office here in Bangkok, and I'm sure they'll be able to put you in touch with other resources that you might need. The other option, of course, is to contact the education institutions directly. So our universities have admissions officers which have specialists for international students. So I would suggest Study in New Zealand is the first stop. Education New Zealand also, I'm sure, will be able to help you. And then if you still want to contact the universities directly to get a direct sense of what they're like, then they usually have websites that are well set up as well that allow international students to make direct contact with their admissions officers.
So first visit the Study in New Zealand website, or then go to the office to discuss directly with the personals. Exactly.
But the Study in New Zealand website, I think is good because I think it's constantly updated with new developments. And as you rightly pointed out, with COVID-19 being such a fast-moving, fluid sort of situation, that probably has the most up-to-date information on new developments as well.
And will there be auto suggestions that you can suggest to Thai students who are interested in studying in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think, my suggestions would be, please keep, if you want to study in New Zealand and you're focused on looking at New Zealand, please ensure that you continue to keep that focus. New Zealand, our universities are all within the top 3% of international universities. The Economist Intelligence Unit has voted us the #1 country in terms of preparing students for the future. And if we look beyond COVID, right, we're going to have to be very, very different in terms of a lot of innovations and a lot of ways we approach things. So the New Zealand education system is one which very much focuses on innovation, which very much focuses on interactive educational experiences, so very working closely with other people, and also on problem solving. So we're very much focused on not only ensuring people are very well prepared for the current world, but that they're also prepared for the future global community. And that's very important to us. So we believe that the New Zealand international education experience is a very strong one in preparing students for the international community and for the future. And I think, as we've discussed at length this morning, some of the challenges that we're going to face in the future are different probably to what we expected would be the case at the beginning of the year, but I think you have to have a very strong foundation in sort of critical thinking, identifying and solving problems, working with others, and I think these are all things that the New Zealand education system really focuses strongly on. The other thing is you'll have a fantastic experience in our country. We're very multicultural, we're very friendly, we're very diverse, we're very beautiful, we're very clean, we're very safe. So for example, New Zealand was one of the first countries to introduce a code for pastoral care for international students, which ensures that every single educational institution has to provide us a very strong level of care and is closely monitored on that. So we're a welcoming country, we're a friendly country, and we're a safe country as well.
Right, New Zealand is in my top destinations after COVID.
Well, there you go, you should come and study. You can do a PhD or something, it'll be fantastic. Go to the Study in New Zealand website.
Possible, highly possible. Now before we end, is there anything you would like to tell to Thai students or students at Mahidol?
Well, I'd like to thank the students at Mahidol for tuning into our interview, and I'd strongly encourage students at Mahidol to consider taking New Zealand as your international study experience if you're looking at an international study experience. I know Mahidol's a very, very high quality university, and one which, as you say, University of Canterbury, but New Zealand has a very strong positive relationship with. So thank you for tuning in, thank you for interviewing me and giving me a chance to talk about a number of very interesting and important matters, and for being such a good good interviewer, and I hope many of you will look to New Zealand as a future study option. And then stay safe and be careful, and we hope to see you soon.
Now I believe that was the last questions, and on behalf of Mahidol University, I would like to thank you very much for being so kind in answering all the questions. We have learned so much about New Zealand today, and I believe that that knowledge will be useful for students who are interested. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for watching. We will see you again in the second episode of the Virtual Internationalization Update. For today, thank you very much. Goodbye. สวัสดีครับ
สวัสดีครับ
Thank you.